Hello guys, today I am going to do a basing tutorial. Basically it's really simple. All you need is a base, a piece of slate, some sand and some paints and glue and paintbrushes obviously. So I'll start off by telling you what you're going to need. 3 paintbrushes, a rubbish old one that is no good for painting detail at all, that's going to be our dry brush. A standard sized painting brush, this is the standard brush from Games Workshop, and then quite a fine one, not your best fine detail brush, but just something that still holds a point. We're going to be using this to paint on a bit of glue. You'll need your base and your slate, some PVA glue, some super glue, and then some paints. You're going to need a dark grey or a mixture of black and white or black and grey. I'm going to be using mainly a Baden Black, Dawnstone, and then a really light dry paint called, if I can find it, I think it's called Longbeard Grey. Yeah, Longbeard Grey. You can use just black and white if you want to, but I like using a mixture of these, then just this, then just this. You'll also need your sand, as I've said. Don't buy the stuff from if you want to buy the stuff from Games Workshop, buy the stuff from Games Workshop, but you can get huge bags of sand. They're almost exactly the same from places like B&Q or Wix or somewhere like that. They'll probably cost you a 1,000th of the price, and that's not even an exaggeration. Alternatively, you can use a texture paint like Sterling Mud and then dry brush it with Tyrant Skull. That's up to you. You'll also need a primer. I'm going to be using Chaos Black from Games Workshop. So let's get started making it. The first thing we're going to do is take our piece of slate and super glue it to the base. Now with super glue, less really is more. Use too much and it doesn't actually stick very well. I like to try and get it over the top of the slot in the middle of the base as much as possible, because otherwise when you glue the sand on, the sand can fall through and the glue can fall through, and then you end up with a strange divot. So if you put the slate over the top, then that's less likely to happen. Obviously with this piece of slate you can't get it completely over, but it's still better than nothing. Once that's dry, which will probably only take a few seconds, we're going to get a small amount of glue, or well, actually however much glue you want, onto a palette, and then just paint it on to all the areas where the slate isn't on the base, leaving the rim. It can be a good idea to put it on top of a paint pot with a little bit of blue tack or plasticine on top, so you don't get gluey fingers. The reason I'm gluing with PVA and putting the sand on after I've super glued the slate down is because it gives the appearance that the slate is a piece of a larger rock protruding from the earth, rather than just a random piece of rock that's happened to sit on top of the ground. Okay, so when that's all covered in PVA, you're going to take some sand and sprinkle it over the top. This is, I think, medium ballast from Woodland Scenics. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of that on, not completely covering it. Give it a tap to get some off. And then I'm going to pour some finer sand on, which is just, I think, like paving sand from B&Q, which I have put somewhere. Behind the glue. Remove any from the rim just with your thumb. Then you're going to let that dry. As you can see, there's a small hole here where the slot in the base is. Now after this is dry, what I'll do is I'll put a little bit more glue on, put some more stones on, and then eventually, after 1 or 2 layers, that will cover that up. What you can do is, if you find a larger piece of sand in here, then you can just put a bit of super glue near the edge and then super glue that piece over the top, and then that'll give the other bits of sand somewhere to stick to so they don't fall down that hole. So I'm going to leave this to dry and show you one that I've already started. Now I've done the exact same thing to this one as I have with this one, just this one the glue is dry. So I'm going to take this off, stick that up there, put this on here. So the next thing we need to do is prime it with Chaos Black. I will prime it and then I shall return once it's dry. Okay, so this base is now all primed. I've used Chaos Black, as I think I've already mentioned. The reason being is that this base is going to be predominantly dark colours, and it just gives the overall finish a more dark look than if you primed it with white. So the first thing we're going to do is use I'm going to be using a mix of black and grey to make a dark grey. You can use a mix of black and white or just a dark grey out of the pot. That doesn't really matter, that's up to you, just as long as you're using a dark grey. I'm going to take a little bit out of that. I found about a 50-50 mix of these paints works best. Probably a 3-to-1 of black and white if you're doing it that way. Yeah, there you go, that's about the colour you want. Here. You want to mix that in with a bit of water, if I can find my water, just because a few thinner layers mixed with water will clog up the details of this slate a lot less than one great big thick wad of paint. So a bit of water makes it thinner and less likely to obscure the natural detail on this slate. You just go over the slate with this dark grey. It won't cover the whole thing completely at first. Doesn't matter if you go over onto the sand a little bit. Just make sure you cover the whole thing. Okay, I'm going to dry this up and do a few more layers off camera, and then once it's dry I'll come back and show you the next step. So the third layer of the dark grey is now completely dry, so we're going to move on to a dry brush with Dawnstone or a medium grey if you're using a mix of black and white. Once that's completely dry, which it should be fairly quickly because our brush is almost completely dry, we're going to do a second dry brush of Longbeard Grey or a really light grey if you're mixing black and white. That's now done. This stone is now completely done. So the next thing we're going to do is paint the sand or the ground. I like to start with a base of Rhinox hide, or if you're still on the old paints, that's scorched brown. Any kind of dark brown really works nicely for this. So switch back to your standard brush, bit of paint from the pot onto the palette, standard addition of water, and then carefully avoiding the stone we've just painted, paint all the sand with this watered down brown. So that's now completely done. Well, it might need another layer or two when it's dry, but I'll dry it off and see if it does, and then I'll come back and show you the next step once this is dried. The next step for this base, once the brown is all dry, is to give it a intermediate dry brush with a slightly lighter brown. I am going to be using Caltham Brown, I think, and that'll go nicely. Okay, once that's dry, I'm going to give it a final dry brush with Tyrant Skull. Now we have a pretty good base for our miniatures. This would do fine as a base for any kind of model. If you want, you can turn the video off now and have a go yourself. But what I think really makes the base is a little bit of fauna. You can see here I've added a couple of tufts of scorched grass, I think that's what it's called, yeah, from Games Workshop, and a bit of clump foliage. And on this one I've added some trails of ivy across the top, and this is another piece of clump foliage which I've just painted on some petals. If you're using this basing technique for a subterranean model, or something that comes from particularly barren land like this cave troll from the Misty Mountains, then putting any kind of plant life on the base really isn't necessary, and will actually make it look, well, it won't make it look weird, but it won't make sense for the model. So I've left this one completely barren. But if you're making a model or making a base for a model that comes from a particularly flowery or green realm, such as Rivendell, Mirkwood, Arnor in this case, then a bit of grass or a bush can really bring the base together. So what we're going to do is use a bit of PVA glue. We're just going to paint that on in patches or spots on the base. I'm only going to do a couple on this one. I like to put the grass in kind of nooks and crannies underneath the rock. Or as if it's coming out from the side of the rock. So just get a bit of your grass, hold it over the pot so it just, what's wasted isn't wasted, it just goes straight back in. Sprinkle it on. Oh, that's my phone. I'll get to them in a minute. And then shake that off. And I'll come back on once this is dry and I've answered my phone. Alright, sorry about that. I've given this a little blow to get the stragglers off, the little bits of grass that didn't actually go onto any glue. So you've got a couple of, oops, not my camera, a couple of little tufts there. Another thing you can do is add pieces of this clump foliage to make little shrubs. So you just, if you want to do that, just get a little bit, squeeze it up, drop a super glue, say here, really small amount of super glue, because otherwise it makes the clump foliage go hard. Carefully pop that on there, and then if you want to put flowers on it like I have with this one, that's literally just dabs of red paint. I used a old fine detail brush which I'd cut off to make a small circular area to just jab at it with. Red works well, pink works well. I did have trouble with white. I couldn't get that to work particularly well, but yeah, red's nice. Just jab it on into random patches. And then that can be a little shrub of some sort. I'm not a gardener. I don't know what it looks like. A bit small to be a rose bush. But yeah, that's quite a nice finishing touch. Gives the base a little bit of colour as well. Another thing you can do is paint on trails of ivy with just paint on lines, kind of randomly fork and veer off with PVA glue, really thin lines, and then just get some really fine green flock, sprinkle it over the top, sprinkle it over the glue, little tap, little blow, and there you have some nice little ivy trails. If you've got it in places you don't want, just use the paintbrush to push it back to where it's supposed to go. You probably don't want to use all of these plant ideas or foliage ideas on a single base, because in my opinion that looks a little bit overkill. But if you vary it in an army using all these different techniques, you'll end up with a really well based army. The last thing we have to do is paint up the rim, let the glue dry, and then this base will be completely done. For the rim I usually use Caltham Brown, although this is running out and they don't make it anymore, so I will have to choose a new paint. I know it sounds like it's not really very important, but choosing the right rim colour really brings an army together and makes it look just a little bit more complete. A lot of people use plain black, a lot of people use varying shades of brown. I've even seen gold for some special miniatures, but Caltham Brown is my favourite. They used to use green almost exclusively, but yeah, this is my favourite one. If you have any suggestions for what I can use after I run out of this, please leave that in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe and comment on this video. I will finish up the base, the rim, with Caltham Brown, and then I'll finish with a few still pictures of this and some of the other slate bases that I've done. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and stick around because there'll be more videos coming up soon.